In the last section, we got some content to show up on the screen, but it literally looks pretty ugly here. So in this section, we're going to work on moving the content down on the page a little bit to bring it into view. Now, if we were writing an HTML-based application, we would normally require or create a separate style sheet and use CSS to move our content around on the page, right? To give it really the look that we wanted. So when we're using React Native, we still have access to some CSS-like concepts, but the CSS that we write or the styling code that we write is not included on a separate style sheet. Instead, we're going to define the look of our component right inside of this file by writing JavaScript instead of CSS. So to do so, we're going to import another object off of the React object. We'll say var style sheet equals react.stylesheet. Next, underneath of our component definition, I'm going to add another comment here, and we'll say style the React component. So this last comment here really forms the last major section that we're going to see in almost all of our files. And this is really some boilerplate that's going to be repeated all the time in almost all the code we write. First, we import some code that we need, taking the form of the require syntax on top, and then some properties that we may or may not pull off of the required object. Next, we'll create a React component, we'll style it, and then we will either show the React component on the screen, or in future sections, we'll export some of the code, and we'll talk about exactly what that means when we get there. So back to our styling, we're going to create a style sheet using the style sheet object. So we'll say var styles equals style sheet dot create, and then we're just going to pass it an object. So we pass an object to the create method right here, and the properties that we put inside of this object are going to be turned into usable styles that we can apply to different elements inside of our component, like our view or our text elements. Our primary goal for styling is going to move the days of the week lower down on the page. So we're going to do this by applying some styling to the view element so that everything contained within inside of view gets moved down on the page a little bit. So to do that, we're going to first write some code, and then we're going to talk exactly about what it's doing here. So we'll say container is going to be our key, and the property will be another object. And inside of this object, we're going to define 3 separate properties. And again, we're going to write all this out, and we're going to talk about exactly what's happening. So we'll say flex is 1, justify content is center, and align items is center. Next, just one more little step here. Up on the view tag, I'm going to add a space, and then we'll say style, and then we'll do curly braces, styles dot container. Cool. So I'm going to save this and refresh it. And it looks like we've got a little bit of an error here. I made a typo right here. We have react.stylesheet with a lowercase s. That should in fact be uppercase. Let's save it. And there we go. Days of the week centered on the page. Okay, so a lot of code on the screen here. Let's talk about exactly what just happened. So again, React Native does not have CSS per se, but it borrows a lot of concepts from CSS. And we write this code that kind of looks like CSS as JavaScript within our component. We created a style sheet and gave it one property, a container. The name of this property right here is really up to us. We can decide what to call it. It could be container, it could be wrapper, it could be just about anything that we want. After defining that property, we passed it an object with a little bit of configuration options here. First, we added the flex property. So we're going to talk about flex and flexbox in a future section a whole bunch, probably more than you ever want to know. But for right now, what we'll say about flex is that by saying flex is 1, we're telling, hey, view component, I want you to expand on the page as much as possible. I want you to fill up all of space on the screen that you possibly can. If you're familiar with normal CSS, you can kind of think of this as saying height 100%, width 100%. That's what really happens when we set flex to 1. Next, we defined the justify content property, and we gave it the value of center. So as you might imagine, that's centering this element on the screen. And we also have align items and center. So, what's the difference here? We have justify content and we have align items. There's got to be some difference between the two. So what justify content does is it says in the Y direction, so up and down on the page, I want you to be centered. Align items, on the other hand, says in the X direction, so the width of the page, I want you to be centered. So let's see what happens when we drop align items. I would now expect days of the week to no longer be centered in the X direction, or the width of the page, but because we still have justify content as center, I'm going to expect it to still be right around about right here. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and sure enough, there we go. So again, we'll talk a whole bunch about styling in a future section, and the difference, some of the nuances between justify content and align items. I'm going to refresh this. We'll talk more about the difference between these two properties because there are some very subtle differences. But for now, I think we can agree that by adding both these tags with the center property, we'll center our content on the screen. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is that we took the styles.container property and we added it to a very particular element on the screen, right? We added it to the view tag. We can very easily add other styles. So let's say I wanted a text style, like so. And I could say style is styles.textstyle. So I can add styling to any element within my JSX that I want just by making reference to my style sheet, a particular property on the style sheet. I'm going to go ahead and remove this text tag because we're not going to be styling it just yet. Cool. Okay, so with all that about Flexbox, let's talk about a little bit more inside the next section.